For centuries, whispers of hidden wisdom have echoed through ancient texts, secret societies, and sacred symbols. A wisdom said to transcend religion, empire, and even time itself. In the early 20th century, a young man with no formal education and no credentials somehow uncovered it. His name was Manly Palmer Hall, and what he discovered connects forgotten rituals, lost civilizations, occult orders, and the very architecture of the human mind. Whether you believe that the world is shaped by hidden hands or guided by higher truths, what Hall uncovered forces us to reconsider both. Hall's work asks a question that we can't ignore. What if the secrets of the past were never lost, only hidden in plain sight? In 1875, in a New York parlor thick with pipe smoke and seance whispers, a Russian mystic unveiled a vision of the future unlike anything the modern world had seen. Her name was Helena Blavatsky, and she called her movement Theosophy. Theosophy promised a front-row seat to the occult frameworks of history. It spoke of karma and reincarnation, of invisible planes of existence, and of adepts, a brotherhood of masters that have been guiding us through the ages. At its heart was a sweeping story of evolution, what Helena called root races, 7 of them, each rising and falling across cycles of time, from ethereal beings of pure light to the mighty but corrupted Atlanteans, to us, the so-called 5th race, still stumbling in the half-light of materialism. To some, Blavatsky's theology was a revelation. To others, a distortion of history and myth that concealed more than it revealed. For Manly P. Hall, Theosophy was both a source of inspiration and a cautionary tale. The same myths that promised universal brotherhood could, in other hands, be twisted into something else entirely. A gospel of blood and soil, a doctrine of destiny that would help ignite the fires of the 20th century. I should be clear, Theosophy was not the Mysteries Reborn. It was a modern movement, born in the late 19th century, that borrowed freely from East and West, myth and scripture. Its teachings do not represent the ancient initiations themselves. But they did shape the world Manly P. Hall grew up in, and they remain essential to understanding his era. By the time Hall was a teenager in Los Angeles, the Theosophical Society had chapters across the United States. His own grandmother, Florence Palmer, was drawn to its circles. In those years, Hall was surrounded by its books and pamphlets, its talks of karma and reincarnation and the masters of wisdom. For Hall, Theosophy was the doorway. It was his first glimpse into a universe where history was symbolic, where mystical laws guided the rise and fall of civilizations, and where sages were said to guard the arc of human destiny. It was the foundation of what he would become. Helena Blavatsky's Theosophy was built on 3 great principles. First, that humanity is one family, bound together by spiritual law. Second, that the world's religions were never meant to be rivals of one another. The symbols that they carry, whether it's the Egyptian scarab or the Buddhist wheel or even the Christian cross, these were all fragments of a single teaching that Hall himself would later call the secret doctrine of all ages, And third, that beyond the world of the senses lies a vast, unseen order of planes, forces, and even intelligences. It was a vision at once universal and esoteric. Karma and reincarnation explained the justice and perceived injustices of life. The subtle bodies and astral worlds opened a map of hidden dimensions. And above all, the masters of wisdom, an invisible brotherhood of adepts, were said to watch over humanity, guiding its evolution. Sound familiar? At the core of Theosophy's teachings was a vast cosmology of human evolution. She spoke of root races, 7 great stages of mankind, each rising and falling across ages of Earth. Each of these root races unfolded on Earth in cycles or rounds, with 7 sub-races within each root race. We are currently in the 5th root race. It was the secret history of the human soul, the law of evolution written across the stars and continents alike. Blavatsky laid out an entire cosmic prehistory of mankind. 7 great stages of humanity, each with 7 sub-stages stretching back through lost continents and races of giants, and projecting forward into luminous beings still to come. This is the doctrine of the root races. It's elaborate, it's controversial, but this system became the backbone of Theosophy, and it's really impossible to understand its influence or the later distortions that sprang from it without first following Blavatsky down this rabbit hole. So from Blavatsky's research, which we'll cite later, she theorized that the first version of us was what she called ethereals. They laid the groundwork for physical humanity. This was before we had actual bodies and we operated as purely spirit intelligences. We were made up of subtle astral matter and essentially looked like light beings. They inhabited physical space around the North Pole, which is why later this race was referred to as the Polarians. The second race was the Hyperboreans. My fellow researchers out there may recognize these from the Thule Society, which we'll touch on in just a bit. The Hyperboreans were half physical, half ethereal. These were giant beings that again inhabited a land called Hyperborea, near the northern territories. But the climate there was that of springtime because this was before the shift in the Earth's axis. Blavatsky said the Hyperboreans were sweat-born, which is a way of saying they reproduced by a sort of spiritual osmosis. These semi-etheric giants exuded drops of their own essence, and from these droplets, new beings condensed. It was reproduction by emanation, and over time, the spirit would thicken into matter. The third race was the Lemurians, from Lemuria or Mu. Now we were completely physical, but titanic in size, said to be 15 to 20 feet tall. Lemuria was said to be a vast continent in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. They were originally androgynous, but later sexes separated for the first time, and we finally had the physical representation of the duality of male and female. These beings also developed speech so that we communicate audibly instead of just telepathically. This is the stage where human form became fixed in physicality. This is where the races started to split off. Blavatsky theorized that some Lemurians bred with animals or what she called lesser humans. I told you this was going to be controversial. The next race was the Atlanteans, who appear and were human, but had advanced psychic powers and technology. They had a very advanced civilization and possessed occult powers like telepathy and telekinesis. As we all know, the story goes that eventually the Atlanteans became corrupt in their morals, giving into ego, turning to black magic and materialism, and that is allegedly what caused their collapse. Blavatsky said that its survivors spread across the world, founding new civilizations in Egypt, the Americas, and India. Blavatsky claimed that we live in the fifth root race, which she called the Aryan. And by that word, she didn't mean Germans, as the Nazis later would, but the broad sweep of humanity since the fall of Atlantis. She divided this root race into 7 branches. The first, she said, were the early Hindus of Vedic India. The second, the Arabic and Semitic peoples. The third, the Persians and Zoroastrians. The fourth, the Greeks and the Romans, who carried the torch of Western culture. The fifth, the Teutonic and Germanic peoples, spreading through Northern Europe. And the sixth, the Slavs of Eastern Europe. And the seventh, still to come, a future synthesis arising, she believed, from the Americas. Each branch, in her view, carried a different piece of humanity's development. Religion, philosophy, science, or culture. The danger, she warned, was that over time each branch would degenerate, and a new one must take its place. To her followers, this theory created a sort of map of human destiny, a vision of where we'd been and where we might be headed through a spiritual lens. Blavatsky claimed that after the Aryan race, which is our current humanity, a new order would one day appear, the sixth root race. They would be more luminous than us, their bodies finer, less dense, their minds no longer bound to reason alone, but open to intuition and psychic vision. She believed this new race would emerge first in the Americas, an amalgam of all the world's peoples heralding a new stage of evolution. Just as the Atlanteans fell through corruption, so too the Aryans risked collapse through materialism. But the sixth race, she said, would turn once more towards spirit, preparing humanity for its final transformation. The final stage in Blavatsky's vision was the seventh root race, the end of the cycle, and these beings would no longer be flesh and blood as we are, but luminous, ethereal, closer to gods than men. No hunger, no sex, no material weight, only pure consciousness, perfected and complete. In that distant age, she said, humanity will have learned every lesson of matter, and the earth itself will enter into rest. The cycle will close, and spirit will return to spirit. What began as shadows will end as light. The root races were the most elaborate part of Blavatsky's system, but they weren't the whole of it. At its heart, Theosophy taught something far simpler, that every soul is immortal, and that through the twin laws of karma and reincarnation, we are shaped life after life until we awaken to higher consciousness. Wrapped around the body are subtler sheaths, astral, mental, spiritual, through which the soul journeys after death, passing into unseen planes before returning again. It taught that no religion held the full truth. Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, Zoroastrian all preserved fragments of a single wisdom, a hidden doctrine that could be reconstructed if we learned to read beneath the surface of myth and scripture. And it taught that humanity was not alone. Behind history, Blavatsky said, stood the masters of wisdom. They were hidden adepts, guiding evolution from age to age, which I think obviously influenced Hall's belief in his order of the quest. To her followers, this was proof that the mysteries had never died, only withdrawn from sight. It was a sweeping vision, cosmic in scale and yet intimate in its moral law, and it captured thousands. Critics of Theosophy said it was based in fantasy, but to its believers, it was the most compelling synthesis of East and West the modern world had ever seen. Manly P. Hall absorbed much of this vision. Like Blavatsky, he saw history not as a random sequence of events, but as design, civilizations rising and falling in accordance with higher laws. Yet, unlike her, Hall resisted the temptation to treat myth as anthropology. Hall accepted Atlantis as an actual chapter of history, but also as a mirror reflecting the dangers of power without wisdom. Theosophy gave him language, but he sought to turn its myth into allegories of the soul, maps of consciousness, not plans for race or empire.
We should pause here, because none of this was actually the ancient mysteries themselves. It was Blavatsky's reconstruction, written in the late 19th century, at a time when Western scholars were just beginning to translate Hindu and Buddhist texts. Theosophy was a modern attempt to stitch together East and West into a single philosophy, and it was a daring thing for anyone to try to do in the 19th century. But Helena Blavatsky didn't have the full picture, and here's why.
Blavatsky pulled from Hindu scriptures, Buddhist texts, and Tibetan traditions, and she mixed in Western occult sources, Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, Hermetic writings, even Christian Kabbalah. On top of that, she borrowed heavily from Victorian science and scholarship, Darwin's evolution, new geology, and speculative theories about lost continents like Lemuria and Atlantis. None of this, in and of itself, is a red flag. The problem was in how she combined it. She treated fragments of myth and symbol as literal history. She borrowed scientific terms but twisted them to fit her cosmology. She was cherry-picking ancient truth to confirm her own biases. And much of what she claimed to have learned in Tibet almost certainly came from Western Orientalist books, not first-hand study. Theosophy also had a strong messianic streak. Blavatsky claimed her writings were dictated by hidden masters in Tibet. After her death, Annie Besant and Charles Leadbeater went even further. In 1909, they declared a young Indian boy was the New World teacher, the Messiah of the modern age. They created the Order of the Star in the East, with tens of thousands of members worldwide, preparing for his teaching. But in 1929, the boy shocked the movement by renouncing the role. Theosophy began as a philosophy of universal wisdom, but often slipped into a cult of personality around leaders and supposed saviors. It's one of the main reasons Hall kept his distance. He drew from Theosophy's symbolism, but he rejected its claims to divine messengers and chosen teachers. The long and short of it is Blavatsky was brilliant at synthesis. The system she created was influential, but also deeply flawed.
But there was another problem. The very myths that Blavatsky used to speak of unity, Atlantis, Hyperborea, the destiny of the Aryan race, could be read another way. Stripped of their symbolism, they could become a gospel of blood and soil, a vision of racial purity and conquest.
And in Europe, on the ruins of a lost war, that's exactly what happened. In Germany, the world that Blavatsky imagined was read in another light. Where she spoke of root races as cosmic evolution, others twisted it into a creed of blood purity. Where she spoke of spiritual cycles, they saw a mandate for conquest. This was Ariosophy, the so-called wisdom of the Aryans, a new occult movement that twisted Theosophy into a doctrine of racial purity. Its key figures were George Lanz von Liebenfels, a defrocked monk who preached that white Europeans were descended from godlike extraterrestrials, and Rudolf von Zibotendorf, a Freemason, mystic, and intelligence agent who founded the Thule Society in Munich.
Ariosophy borrowed from Theosophy's myths, like Atlantis, Hyperborea, the Aryan destiny, but it narrowed them into a nationalist creed. Where Blavatsky spoke of universal brotherhood, Ariosophy exalted specifically German blood. It was the marriage of esoteric fantasy with the folkish drive to forge a new German identity.
To them, Hyperborea and Atlantis were not allegories but ancestral homelands. The Aryan was not all of humanity since Atlantis, but one chosen people, destined to rule, and the task was not spiritual growth, but purification. And I have to add here, there really was a people known as the Aryans, and they didn't look like the Malfoys from Harry Potter. They originated in the Indo-Iranian region around 2000 to 1500 BCE. The very name comes from the Sanskrit word Arya, meaning noble or royal.
For some reason, Victorian scholars got obsessed with the word. They stretched it from meaning a very specific Indo-Iranian people to describing the entire Indo-European language family. And from there, it just snowballed into all sorts of wild theories. And Theosophy, followed by Ariosophy, they just ran with it. The Thule Society became a gathering place for folkish mystics, nationalists, and occultists. It was there, in Munich, that esoteric fantasy began to merge with politics. The rings of Thule, the satellite circles, were seeds of a new party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party.
Out of these circles came another idea, vril. The term came from an English novel, The Coming Race, but in Germany it was adopted into Ariosophy as the hidden energy of the Aryan race. Vril was said to be a primordial force, a current of power that the ancient Hyperboreans had once mastered. To Ariosophists, recovering it meant recovering the lost birthright of their people. In my opinion, Vril was just another attempt to gatekeep the divine spark, to take what earlier traditions saw as a universal life force and rebrand it as the secret inheritance of a single chosen people based on third-dimensional aspects such as bloodlines.
Manly P. Hall was alive during this period. He saw how myths could inspire, but also how easily they could be twisted. Where Ariosophy exalted bloodlines, Hall spoke of a brotherhood of man. Where the Thule Society sought political conquest, Hall's Order of the Quest was an invisible fellowship of seekers, philosophers, artists, and visionaries who carried wisdom forward for the good of all. Hall never denied Atlantis or Hyperborea, but for him these were not ancestral homelands to be reclaimed by force. They were symbols of the eternal cycle. Civilizations rise, and then they flourish, and they fall when they betray the light. The lesson is not in purity of blood, but purity of purpose.
While Ariosophy exalted bloodlines, Manly P. Hall's philosophy was its mirror opposite. In The Secret Teachings of All Ages, he wrote that every religion preserved fragments of one wisdom, that humanity was a single family, bound not by race but by spirit. Where the Thule Society turned symbols into weapons, Hall warned that such distortions were the greatest danger of all. In his vision of the Order of the Quest, the guardians of truth were not one people or nation, but seekers of every culture, quietly preserving wisdom for the good of all. Atlantis, Hyperborea, and the root races, these were never meant as manifestos for conquest. They were myths and allegories, lessons about cycles of humanity, but once torn from their meaning, symbols can be twisted into anything. The emblem of a universal brotherhood, or the banner of a Reich. For centuries, fragments of the mysteries have been bent, corrupted, or weaponized. The Crusades, the Inquisition, Ariosophy, all show what happens when wisdom is pressed into the service of power. But the distortion of truth does not make truth itself evil.
Hall refused to fully embrace Theosophy's root race teachings. In his writings, Atlantis and the root races were treated as symbols of historical cycles, not literal racial hierarchies. This was a major point of difference between Hall and more orthodox Theosophists.
Outside the society, Hall faced criticism from another direction. In the mid-20th century, the rise of fundamentalist Christianity in America, especially Baptist and evangelical groups, painted all occult or esoteric teachings as dangerous.
So Hall stood in the middle. Theosophists thought he'd watered down their doctrine. Fundamentalists thought he was a heretic. But Hall's own position remained clear. The mysteries belonged not to one group or one race or one church. He would use Theosophy's structure where it helped, but he refused its dogmas.
Hall's life work was an attempt to restore the mysteries, to peel back the corruption and show that the symbols themselves were never evil. He wasn't alone either. From Jungian psychology in Switzerland to scholars translating texts in America, others too were trying to recover what had been buried. The perennial philosophy, the thread of wisdom that runs through every age.
Hall's Secret Teachings of All Ages wasn't just a compendium of myth and symbol. It was an act of reclamation, a way of saying, the light is still here, hidden under centuries of distortion, and waiting for eyes that can see it.
The lesson carries forward. From Ariosophy to modern cults, the temptation is always the same: to turn symbols into proof of superiority, to whisper that you are chosen, that your bloodline, your vibration, your starseed origin sets you apart from the rest of humanity. Hall warned against this in his own time. The mystics and gurus who sold secret knowledge as a badge of exclusivity. Real wisdom, he said, is never about being chosen above others. It's about awakening to the unity of all. And when anyone claims that your third-dimensional existence is proof of your spiritual status, remember that this is ego, the oldest corruption of all. The mysteries were not given to divide, but to unite. Next time on Hall of Mysteries, behind familiar verses lie secrets most churches won't mention. Hall saw the Bible as a manual of initiation and a warning about invisible forces feeding on human energy. From Eden to Revelation, Hall read Scripture as allegory, but not history. To him, it described the rise and fall of civilizations, the dangers of vampiric entities, and the fate that may still await us all. Join us next time for Hall of Mysteries, Secrets of Sacred Texts. This is Hall of Mysteries, and the veil is lifting.